Thanks for everyone for coming tonight. It's the launch of an Artist in Residence project with support Structure in Residence at Clumber Park, a National Trust property in North Nottinghamshire in partnership with Nottingham Contemporary. My name is Claire Louise Staunton. I am with Laura Guy and Becky Eyre Inheritance Projects, and we are a curatorial group interested in notions of heritage and history making, how an object becomes heritage, how stories transform into history, and conversely, how something, what constitutes newness. A couple of years ago, we were invited by the National Trust to think about artists in residence and not sort of the straightforward commission-based residency, creating a sculpture for a garden, but to see what we could come up with. And so we thought about it, and we're interested in working with artists long-term and thinking about how an artist in residence can work over a period of time with the National Trust property to offer the staff, the organisation, a new way of seeing and existing in their property. And also how an artist placement can offer a new way of telling the story of a property to its public. And it was really important, we felt, that to engage a contemporary partner to work on this together with a contemporary gallery and team, not only to share the audience, but really to have two different platforms so that heritage possibly could be understood through the contemporary, and how the contemporary could be understood through heritage. And also in this particular instance that you'll find more about, Clumber Park, thinking about the urban through the rural, and thinking about exteriors through interiors and vice versa. The other residencies involve the artist Laura Pruvo working with Treasurer's House up in York, in partnership now with the Hepworth Gallery, and Tris von Michel at Gibbside in Gateshead, and working with the Baltic up there. But this is sort of the first residency project launch that has happened, and I'll briefly introduce those people who are on stage, but I hope that throughout the course of the evening it will become a little more clear who they are, why they're really here. But of course in the middle is Gavin Wade, one of Support Structure, the other artist, Lynn Condarelli, couldn't make it this evening, but they were given the free use of a house on Clumber Park. And have now co-published a book with Nottingham Contemporary, co-published a pamphlet, and Gavin, I'm sure, will talk more about the project. Andrew Barber, a curator at the National Trust and responsible for Clumber Park's history as well as many other properties, and Dr. Ava Rovers, an academic from the University of Utrecht and an expert on Helene Kroller. Tomorrow there'll be screenings here, and as part of this project, and on Sunday will be an incredible tour with a coach leaving from here and taking a number of people out to Clumber Park and inviting the members of the public to join Support Structure on a tour made up with the proposals in mind. But before I hand it over to Gavin, I do really need to thank some people, everybody at Clumber, for being so patient and understanding and supportive. In particular, Beth Dawson, Jacqueline Roebuck, Charlotte Jones, Carol Gardner, and Nigel Dorrington, Trevor Presley, and the National Trust East Midlands, Kate Stoddart, and Jane Greenfield, of course. At Nottingham Contemporary, staff past and present, but Isabel Whiteleg, Louise Goldrich, did I get that correct? Godwin, I'm sorry. Laura was working most closely with Louise. Jim Waters, Alex as well, and Dave Thomas, and of course our speakers here tonight. Please, Gavin.
Scene 1. We see the face of a young woman. She is asleep. It is very quiet at first, as credits appear. The woman's face begins to twitch, as though she is having a bad dream. She moans slightly, and her expression grows more desperate. A mix of subtle sounds begin to fade in. As they get louder, we can discern what sounds like a busy office area. It is actually a frantic television studio with the hum of panic in a national emergency. The woman's moans get louder and more desperate as the background sounds reach full volume and the credits stop. The woman sits up, snapping awake. So I'm going to try and give you a run through on things that we would like to do around the world, but mostly in the North Nottinghamshire area of Clumber Park, via the guidebook that you all hold in your hands, because the Lord allowed it to be today that the publications arrived on time for all you people. I'm going to talk a little bit through ideas coming from Clumber House, which I've, as much as can be ascertained, around about 1761, the beginnings of. It can be disputed by people in the audience. Until 1938, which I think can't be disputed. That was when the house ceased to exist as a house. I'm going to talk a little bit about Crollermuller House, which was a house that never existed, but was proposed. I'll explain more about that in 1912. And the Rietveld Sculpture Pavilion, which came to life in 1955 and was used for a short period, and then was rebuilt again in 1964 somewhere else from new materials, and then rebuilt again in 2010 from new materials in the same place as the second version. And all of this feeds into Missing Houses, so a title that myself and Celine was hoping might be the title of this project almost from the start. So a hunch that you get early on, and you try and find other things that are better than it, but come back to it, I suppose, over a long period of time. I think we may have been approached definitely a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. I'm not quite. I'm not sure. It was actually the end, maybe the end of 2010, when we were first, or maybe even mid 2010, something like that. So. Oh, is that? Oh God, see, it seems longer already. I'm just making it up now. It feels like a long period of time of trying to just soak in ideas from a site that neither of us knew or had indeed heard of before. But from the first time that Claire called me up about it, I think it might have been on the phone first of all, and mentioning the site, I think even in the first conversation she mentioned that there was one of the sites that was possible around the country that had a place where a house used to be and wasn't there, and already I was hooked. I was already thought, if something could happen, then that would be an interesting place. And it's a bit of a weird. I don't know exactly why that hooks me, but I can try and talk around that a little bit about what I might think is so urgent about this empty space. So I'm going to work not in chronological order, I suppose, exactly, because I'm starting with telling you that we've made 40 proposals for artworks that myself and Celine would like to make. And this was not our starting point, this was an idea that we came to over time. And the first proposal, which wasn't the first idea we came up with, but which made sense to be first, was to publish an artwork in the form of a book that would contain 40 proposals. And part of our dilemma was, how do we as artists, what do we get out of spending time at a place and absorbing ideas, bringing them back in? What's in it for us? And then how does that fuel our thinking to move on in the future, to offer things back, I suppose? And I guess we weren't quite sure what was in it, apart from this idea of an empty house. And we had another another empty or missing house in mind. So first of all, you have the publication that is proposal number 1 in your hands. Proposal number 2 is to construct a 1-to-1 scale model of Clumber House on its original site, so which has been left empty since 1938, and that the model would be built from scaffolding and a white canvas fabric, and the model would appear as a ghost house. So this was a later idea as well, an idea of walking around the site and beginning to imagine ghosts or perhaps other vehicles for our imagination. But this second idea was very early on, something really important to us. And the image over on the right-hand side is a very interesting historian, John Fletcher, who we met at various times on the park, and seems to have become the what's the word, sort of unofficial historian of Clumber, but also a publisher of probably the most detailed historical books around different periods of Clumber Park and the Dukes. And I'm going to go into some details, but I am going to be relying on an expert here sitting in front of me here, Andrew, who knows a lot more than me about all of these things. So I think in a way it's probably to acknowledge, I don't know, a level of engagement or historical accuracy or detail that even I'm interested in. I'm sort of interested in enough to stimulate the next idea, to stimulate a progression and a challenge and a linkage to another thought all the time. I'll explain what's going on in that image there of John Fletcher's hand holding a 1-to-1000 model of Clumber House as we go through the proposals. But here you get a view from the opposite bank of Clumber Lake, looking over at where Clumber House would be. So here you have steps that would lead you up, and you wouldn't, if Clumber House was still there, then you wouldn't be able to see these buildings at the moment. You would see the maybe the corner of this one here, but the building would be here somewhere, filling this large space. And this view was important to us also from our first site visit. As soon as we came to Clumber, we were interested in what the viewpoints were, how the landscape had been altered and articulated to express power and authority, and a sense of control, or to create a situation that would make an individual who has all this power feel like he deserves it and it's right that he has this power and authority, which of course is what really all of this structure and this site is about. It's supporting one extremely special person and his connected family, and then you see a rest of society building out from this aristocratic figure at the centre of this ducal estate. So proposal number 3 is construct a 1-to-1 scale model of Krollermuller House as designed by Mies van der Rohe in 1912 in Wassenaar, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, the Netherlands, on the opposite bank of Clumber Lake to the original site of Clumber House. The model would be built from scaffolding and white canvas fabric, and the model would appear as a ghost house. And here we come to the first reason why the idea of a missing house might have rung bells in my mind. And then as soon as I spoke to Celine and we talked about the site as well, she also, we both leaped on this idea that we're slightly obsessed or waiting for an opportunity to explore an idea that we had come across, but we didn't know how to explore it. We didn't know what to do with it. We just thought that we had the seed of an idea. And this was something that we had come across, this image, which is connected to Mies van der Rohe and to saying that he had produced a full-size model of a building for some people called George Kroller and Helen Krollermuller in 1912, and it was built so that they could look at it and choose whether they wanted that house or not. And we were amazed that someone would do that. And I think it's actually a really practical, brilliant idea to do, because otherwise you're just guessing, you're going on your instinct. Depends how good your intuition is, or your understanding of plans or relationship of space and form, So often people just haven't got a clue what a building is going to look like. Even if you look at a model, you just don't know what it's going to feel like. And this is the only way that you can actually do that. And still, it's not real. You're not going to feel what the marble's like, or the way that the grass finishes and the way that the stone floor is going to finish, because actually this is just made out of cloth and wood. And I only found out towards the end of making the publication that it was apparently, I've read it in one place, that it was on wheels. So I'm waiting for Ava to explain more about this as well, because she knows more about me than this in this area. So, but I found that idea fascinating. That, of course, if you might want to move the building that way 5 feet, so you want it on wheels, so lots of people can push it all together. And I have had that experience before in China, of making a huge structure and just having 40 people pick it up and move it somewhere else, and that felt fantastic. So that was, that was all about power and possibility of seeing that being done. And in a way, there's something here. So there's more ideas to come out that aren't in these proposals as well, in sense of moving architecture around. So that was one thing in our minds that we knew was something special. And although a few people knew about it, whenever we mentioned it to people, there weren't that many people who had heard of this thing. So, and it was good that both of us had the same thought, which is often how we work. When we both then agree and decide or come up with something very similar, we know we can move forward on that. So I thought I'd just throw in an image of the first project that we made together, just to explain. So Celine's background was, she was trained as a curator at the Architecture Association, and I was trained as a painter, actually. But I call myself an artist curator now. And we, in 2003, I went looking for an architect to collaborate with. And luckily I found Celine through some mutual friends, through Catherine Boehm and Andreas Lang. They introduced us, and I think immediately we found that our ideas connected, and we were interested in the notion of support, that architecture is support and art is support, and that they could both be integrated together to support a variety of different situations. And so we worked since 2003 producing a sequence of support structure projects where we would offer our expertise or offer our art as support for how would you like to be supported, and we would try and resolve your problem and provide support to whatever situation you had. In this case, this was an exhibition that needed a system of how to be curated, have 30 curators in 30 days who were members of the public, some who were going to have a little bit of experience, but others who weren't curators. And so we had to design a piece, we were interested in designing a piece of architecture that would program the visitor in such a way to turn them into a curator. That was our remit. And I think to an extent we succeeded. And there were a few of the images. So I'm back to this same page, talking about this idea that when we went there, we thought the perfect place to rebuild the Mies van der Rohe building could be on the opposite bank. So it becomes a mirror reflection across the lake of the Clumber house. And I think the more we looked, the more we found that still was the perfect site for it, because when we looked at the way that the land could be used in that area, then that opposite bank was used for, I think it's called something like the Clumber show or something like that. It was called, and they would build large tents on the opposite bank and have this sort of festival event there. So it seemed also to make sense, which then prompted other ideas that we could use the Mies van der Rohe building as a festival house of some kind. Now, proposal number 4 was where we started to think that this really made sense. We started to find that not only did they want to get rid of Clumber House, that the dukes who weren't living in the house at that time, because it was too big, it was too difficult to manage, had started to imagine other places around Clumber to build other houses, and they were Woodcock Hill, Cow Pasture Field, Cabin Hill, Ash Tree Hill Wood, or Icehouse Hill. And the photograph of John Fletcher's hand is on Icehouse Hill. He took us to Icehouse Hill. We didn't know where it was. He took us there and talked about what they would have done if they built the house here, which trees they were going to knock down so that they could see the lake, how again they would alter the landscape in Clumber. And we found that fascinating. So each time there's a choice that's like a lifestyle choice in a way, it affects the entire environment, which is going to affect the working of the site. Maybe is going to affect the technical methods that things are done, the ways that people make money on site, or the whole range of things come from these decisions that are made by the Duke, who wants to be able to see a lake, create a lake in the first place. This idea of using the timber from the trees felled to clear the site as the scaffolding support to make the one-to-one scale models is from the first time we went there. It was just after the snow. So yeah, maybe that was that January visit, and we had very heavy snow that winter, and many of the trees had been damaged by the weight of the snow, so much so that the ranger who took us around that day, we've never really, he'd seemed to vanish after that point, but he was this slightly mystical warrior kind of a ranger who took us around and told us things that were really interesting, and he told us about the day he came in after Christmas, and the first day he came in, and he saw this main tree, incredible tree, as he come in, and two of the main branches had broken and fallen down, and he just sat in his car and wept, and we just thought that was amazing. And then we thought we should use all this wood. All of this wood has symbolic power it would make somebody cry. It's that special. It's such an old tree, and now that landscape has gone forever. That we should, and all the wood's getting chopped down and sold off, or something's happening with it. But maybe we could symbolically use that to rebuild a ghost house. So in a way, each time we went there, we were sort of looking for incidental things, or just finding a place, or finding a detail. And in a way, I really wanted to show this image large because I like the quality of the detail on this. The photographs are taken by Alex Bailey, who is an assistant at Eastside Projects, which I run as director as well. And he's an artist who uses photography, and I'd been looking at his work and seeing how he was using film and processing things, and wanted to produce a series of contextual images of the site, which also paid homage in a way to the history of the site and tried to capture a sort of old atmosphere of it. So we wanted to make these film photographs that he's hand produced. The interest in Mies led us further, so that we were interested in Mies's partner when Mies was still in Germany, before he fled at the start of the Second World War to go to America. And his partner was Lily Reich, and she produced these incredible curtain forms and exhibitions at the Silk and Velvet Cafe. This is around about 1924 or 31, can't remember which one, around that period. And that had really influenced us, and we had made forms at the Economist building in London that played on some of Mies's pavilion structures, which I have an image of in a second, and Lily Reich's curtains, and then started to be interested in the sort of politics of curtains, the politics of materials, and how they're used. So Mies and Lily were using them to represent Germany around the world in international expos, and it was becoming a sense of it was being used politically to show the skill, the efficiency, and the quality of German fabrication system and materials. And Mies went on to, although Helen Kroller had rejected his house in 1912, he went on to become one of, if not the most significant and influential architects of the 20th century. This is a shot of the Barcelona pavilion, which is another international expo, so representing Germany in Barcelona, and that we then looked at this was possibly the fourth building that we could have looked at, but we decided it didn't add as much to the narrative. But this Barcelona pavilion, it was dismantled after the expo, and then it was put on a train to go back to Germany, and it was mysteriously lost. And if you look at the quality of the marble that's going on here, this is like mysteriously lost. It ended up in somebody else's garden. You know, it made somebody else's house. It ended up in some other German politician's little project. So, but it was rebuilt later. I think quite later. It says in the book, I think it was maybe in the 1980s that it was rebuilt in Barcelona, and you can go and visit it again now. But we decided not to dwell on that as much, but we thought it was still an interesting possible site for us to go and do projects in the future that could come from Clumber, so to link Clumber with the Barcelona pavilion perhaps. And also inspired this curtain show that Celine and I co-curated at Eastside Projects in 2010. And then another significant thing happened when I was following up a suggestion from Dan Graham, and he's a real sort of pioneering artist who started making work in the 1960s and is famous for making pavilion structures which are not intended to be sculptures per se. They're intended to be triggers to generate art, and the art is your response to those structures and the way that you look at yourself and other people and the way that you look at other people looking at you. So he's interested in this idea of architecture pushing triggers that begin to allow you almost physically to understand what you are as a human being in many ways. So, and he had said to me that I should look at this book by Penelope Curtis called Patio and Pavilion, and that Penelope's brilliant and she's a great writer and she's written all this brilliant stuff, and there's this book and I'm in the book and you have to get the book, and it's wonderful. It's like the best thing that's been written about pavilions. You have to go and read it. So eventually I got a copy, and it's not bad. It's quite a nice book. But we'd already started thinking about Clumber, and almost on the third page as I opened the book was this image, and again it was like a little alarm bell with the idea of us thinking about this house that had gone missing, and suddenly there was this image of somebody holding a building in their hand, a little model. So this is a photograph it's attributed to Rietveld. It doesn't really say who the photographer is. We haven't really been able to find out very much about this image, except that it's in Penelope's book and she doesn't even say where she got it from. And it's called Sculpture Pavilion Model. And we're not even sure that's a real hand or whether it's a statue's hand that he's put the model into and taken this photograph, but a really enigmatic, stunning, fascinating image. And straight away, I thought that this might be another angle for us to think about dealing with the site at Clumber, the idea of holding something very powerful in your hand and making a choice, so you're able to see it, feel it, play around with it and try an idea out. So we thought that this became then a stimulus, and to think about how to visually take on Clumber Park when you're dealing with an enormous, massive site with a village within it, with huge communities and hundreds of thousands of people going through it. How do you take on something like that? And in a way, we thought if you take it to the scale of your hand, that might be a trick to deal with it. Your hand brings everything into focus straight away. So the model is this. This is the Rietveld Sculpture Pavilion, and this is it set in the Krollermuller Park as it is now, and it has a scattering of Barbara Hepworth sculptures around the pavilion. So we came up with this proposal number 20: produce a series of photographs of missing houses based on Rietveld's photograph Sculpture Pavilion, and we wanted to invite people who are residents, staff and users of Clumber Park and ask them to choose places where we could photograph them. So again, I think in a way we started just to think what were simple things that we could do that would always propose other ideas, other works. And sometimes they might be works that we might not want to follow up. It's just the act of proposing that might be the work. And we think of the book and the 40 proposals as an artwork, but there are many of the proposals that I think we really want to do. We would really love to do in some form or other. And I mean, many of them are quite ambitious. So this is another fantastic coincidence. This is Uwe's hand, who is the head chef of Barker's on Clumber Park. It is, and I must add, it is his huge hand. It is the small model. This is the Rietveld Sculpture Pavilion, but we made it so that Clumber House was more the scale of the original Rietveld in the old photograph. And so to do that, we had to shrink down the Rietveld. So, but the reason we sort of wanted this, he actually wanted the Mies van der Rohe on his hand, but I wanted to overemphasize the size of his hand and the scale of the Rietveld. And I was trying to explain to him that even though that was Mies van der Rohe, and he really wanted the Bauhaus person, he wanted Bauhaus on his hand, I was just telling him but that's not, it's not like the real Bauhaus stuff. That's his pre-Bauhaus stuff. It's not really, you want the Rietveld one, that's much more Bauhaus. You want to go for that one. So I think we photographed him with both, so that he could have one with the Mies van der Rohe as well. But that's because brilliantly, his I'm not sure it was his father, it must be his grandfather, went to the Bauhaus. His family is from Weimar, and they went to the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus is this incredibly influential, amazing moment of minds coming together to create a new model for a school, a new model for thinking and practice, and a combination of art, architecture and design and theatre all together in this extremely powerful moment. And at one point Mies van der Rohe was the master of the school. So that was a sort of nice coincidence that we picked up along the way, and that he was so enthusiastic about it because of this. So there is my own slightly smaller hand with the model of Clumber. So we just looked for a completely contemporary system, a way of making a very small model of houses, and found this a rapid prototyping system, which is relatively easy to get hold of now, a very accessible thing and available in most universities, and a really great process and simple way to realise something. So the scale of 1 to 1,000 worked here, whereas this model is scale of 1 to 250, I think. So, and it was also the awareness of this model here, that model which has been pulled out of a much larger model, which I would like to thank Beth again for. I haven't thanked her for that this evening, that it looks so amazing, and it's been yanked out of a model that's been sitting there, that's a very expensive, precious thing that shows you and instructs you what the house was like on Clumber Park. And in a way, we thought that might be wrong to actually have a model of the house there. It gave you too much. It's better to not even have the model there, but even on the model of the site, that should be empty as well. So, and that we should give you that chance to see, to not be able to see the model, not be able to think what the house is like. Only if you come to Nottingham Contemporary could you see what the house is. Or maybe now we have to move that out to Holland and put it into the Krollermuller Museum, or then we put it out to the Barcelona Pavilion, never ever come back to Clumber Park again, tours around the world. That's my empty hand, which we decided to use at the end of the book as well. And the stones behind are the outline of the house, where the house once stood. Now I'm probably talking for too long now, so I will try and wrap up a little bit. This is standing on the house, looking out across the lake to the other side, to the other bank. This is Celine's hand on the other bank, holding the model of the Mies van der Rohe house. So we got this whole series going. And along that way, so there was me and Celine would visit and walk around, and me and Julia Guan, who was our assistant and collaborator on the project as well. And I think, and it was actually when we were talking about saying, what other ideas, what things can we do, that Julia at one point said, well, we have to make a zombie movie here. And each time one of us said something like that seemed maybe stupid at one point, we'd write it down and then come back to it and say, actually, what's good about that? Why do we want to do that? How does that work? And the zombie movie really kept on making more and more sense to us. And then we imagined that perhaps the zombie movie could be characters, and it's just made on the park, and it's an invention of characters who would come from Clumber Park. Maybe now I'm thinking it could be also Helen Krollermuller becomes a character in the zombie movie as well, and she's meeting with the Duke. But this is partly based on, we sort of said an American actress in here because the 8th Duke of Newcastle married an American actress. So there was already a history of an American actress walking around the site and meeting people, and she formed the Women's Institute on Clumber Park. So there's all these amazing histories. All we need to do is just take them out and rub them together with a zombie movie script, and you've just got a fantastic blockbuster movie, So that was the first scene that I started with. I'll just read you one more little section. Scene 8. We begin to listen over the din of the newsroom. TV man 1. I don't believe that, Doctor, and I don't believe... TV man 2. Do you believe the dead are returning to life? TV man 1. I'm not so... TV man 2. Do you believe the dead are returning to life and attacking the living? TV man 1. I'm not so sure what to believe, Doctor. That's scene 8. This is upcycled from George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. We've adapted some of his script, and we've got a long bit to do, of course, because it's got to be like 90-minute movie. So we're going to get around to some more of that on Sunday, in situ, mixing in some of the histories of Clumber and Crollermuller. And I won't have time for the Loch Ness Monster. You've heard a little bit about the beer already, so we're very excited that some of them have been able to actually realise. We weren't that sure that we would do that in a way. That just came because when we went to meet Sandra and have her photographed holding the model, we just, through chatting, talking about making beer, saying, oh, wouldn't it be great to put one of these, like to put your photograph on a bottle of beer? And she said, well, we could do that. And she was really interested in making Clumber beer. She wanted to make more Clumber beer as they're on Clumber Park, and that this could be a photograph of Clumber House on a bottle of beer. So we just kept following that up, and she was really interested in making that forward. So and we were interested in these images not being too precious, sort of putting them out there and letting them be used in a number of different ways, or unexpected ways perhaps. I'm gonna get to the last one. I'll have to miss the Battle of Orgrave and the Tottenham riots, and I will just end on my two other favourite ones. One that I really want to make an ice cream sauce for Clumber Park, and that would be a fantastic project to do, and I think that would just attract even more people to the site. And that was really because when I was angry at the ice cream vans because they don't have sauce, and they have a policy not to have sauce on site, and I thought they're mocking me. It's like some ironic metaphor for the missing house, and it's like your lack in life. You have to have something that you have to know that you're lacking it. And so now I don't want to lack ice cream sauce. I want to bring it back to Clumber Park. And then thought I'd end on this nice image of the giant flagpole that used to fly, and the flag that used to fly in front of Clumber House. Long ago, not that long ago, actually Andrews worked out that it might have come down in about 1930. But we just love this image where it just seems too oversized and too odd. And the idea of that flag being so massive and being spread out, that we thought there's got to be potential there for us to make another work, to propose something. So the one proposal is to put giant flags around the world on sites of missing houses. And on that note, I will pass on to Andrew, except I will just say that I'll move over here. Here we go. So it was a really great pleasure to meet Andrew when we were there, and to go into a lot of detail. Whenever we had a really intensive going through stuff in his office, which was amazing. It was just like a performance in a way of going through material. So it was really great to have Andrew come and speak, because we just felt that he was a real authority on the chance of things, of finding things out. And then and also then we're imagining this talk tonight. We thought it couldn't be me, that I don't know enough about these things in a way to fill in more of the gap for you. So we wanted to invite somebody who knew more about Crollermuller, whether that was someone from the museum. And then Claire had come across Ava. I'm still looking forward to reading the book. I haven't read the book yet, so that's going to be my next book to read. And in a way, that's what I hope that this evening wasn't me just telling you things that I know and things that I've worked out, but actually I'm here to continue to learn more from these two that should continue these ideas to to carry forward, you know. So, and I think that there's probably a lot that I don't know about Helen Muller, so we'll get to that as well. But I'll hand over to you, Andrew.
A nice little understated title for a talk. Money, and always we're losing it. And I'm just here to talk a little bit about the context of that final loss, which ended up with a vacant space where a great mansion had once stood. But to really talk about that, one needs to go back a bit, back to the inheritance of the 7th Duke of Newcastle, who inherited the property in 1879 when he was nobbut a lad. He was about 16. He was off at school. The fascinating thing is, though, that if you were to visit Clumber in 1879 and visit it again now, you wouldn't find very much different. Or at least you'd find a lot of things the same, let's put it that way. Same extremely grand and rather, well, putting you in your place, gates to herald your arrival at this ducal residence. Of course, the Dukes of Newcastle had to work quite hard to impress, because they were sitting in Clumber amidst a series of what are known locally as dukeries. They were one of the dukeries. No less than 5 dukes had their seats within about a 15-mile radius of Clumber at one time. The Dukes of Kingston, Newcastle, Norfolk, Devonshire and Portland. All within that really quite small span, North Nottinghamshire spreading over into North Derbyshire. So as any one of those dukes, you had to work hard to be seen. And they did. Clumber is vast, 3,800 acres of it, a massive lake in the middle of it. As I say, impressive gate lodges at every access, and there are really, it was a public road going through it, so you've got one at each end there, but then you've got 3 other lodges and 2 more sets of gates. I mean, you know, all architectural and F-off grand. And then there would have been the walled gardens. They were still there, 18th century structure, top of the art, and hitting all the science from a point of view of gardening and a control of air temperature, so that you could grow the most exotic fruits. Peaches and nectarines were grown here, both out of doors and indoors, heated walls, and specially designed structures so that the cold air was gently encouraged to form down that central avenue and out through the essentially permeable gates at the bottom. Literally, the cold air would roll off the walls, which were heated, down to that central path and disappear out of the gates at the top there. That was all and was already 100 years old in 1879. And so, okay, we've moved twice, sorry. The Great Lime Avenue, double lime tree avenue, 3 miles of it, had been planted in the 1830s. It was just coming to maturity when the young 7th Duke inherited. And he inherited a house with a most splendid formal garden. Here, one of the most exotic formal gardens, and set amidst a rural idyll of the park. This great formality is statuary all over the place, and if you want to see it, you have to go and trespass on private property in Derbyshire now. It is all at a house at Great Longston. But it was sold away, as we will find. But this great formality, sitting in marvellous contrast with the sylvan beauty of a naturalised English parkland. And then the house, rebuilt after, the house standing there, with a chapel beside it. Extraordinary, because actually the young 7th Duke inherited most unexpectedly. His father was, well, there's one in every family, and the 6th Duke was that one. He enjoyed the company of fast women and slow horses, and he went bankrupt in a very serious way, had to go and live in Paris, which is where the worst of the worst always ended up, and that's where he died. And obviously the chapel wasn't his, that was his father, who was far better gentleman and was actually foreign secretary for a while. But he had a worrying married life and he never finished his chapel, and his chapel remained empty and unfinished through his son's life. And then the young 7th Duke inherited it, and he decided it wasn't good enough at all. Here is the young 7th Duke, who wrote to one of his trustees, who was William Gladstone, saying that he was very glad he'd had his leg taken off. He felt so much better now, because poor little lad, he was dropped when he was a baby, and his leg was deformed and caused him great pain throughout his early years. But about the age of 13, it was amputated, and he had a wooden leg ever since. But he also had a very, very strong Anglo-Catholic faith, which must have been useful to him when 3 months after he inherited the house, which had been closed up during his father's time, but which he was due to live in when he attained his majority, went up in flames. And you can see in the photograph, lithograph, some of the priceless contents, and there certainly were priceless contents, out in the outside being carried out. The wonderful description, Illustrated London News, described almost with relish the tenantry rushing in and pulling out priceless Rembrandts and Boule furniture and piling them up outside, where they were soon covered with a delicate blanket of snow. Saved most of it, actually. It was quite extraordinary, including the extraordinary and celebrated library of Clumber House, all saved. And the house was rebuilt, and here it is, very shortly after it's being rebuilt, and it was rebuilt monstrously, as you can see. A reasonable, proportional, 4-square, 4-pavilioned country house of Palladian form was replaced, or at least was evolved, into a monstrous Victorian labyrinthine, a great serpent of a house that coiled round itself and round this great central tower of a hall, massive great hall inside, marble columns going up on 2 layers with corridors all round it and all the rooms leading off it. What you're seeing here is the most civilized front, because that's what remains of the 18th century house. But the young Duke got his own way and quickly set to replace his grandfather's chapel, which had never been finished internally, and built his own, which is rightly called a mini cathedral. It is vast, it's larger than many parish churches, and it was built and fitted out to suit the intense Anglo-Catholic faith of the young Duke of Newcastle. Anglo-Catholics are sort of, those who don't know, are Anglicans, but they're more Roman Catholic than the Catholics when it comes to ritual and just enjoying lots of nice stuff. Lots of lovely gold and silk and velvet and jewellery and carving, but particularly gold. And here is a chalice commissioned by the Duke, by Kroll, a communion chalice. And he was quite serious, as I say, about it. He formed a choir school, went around, and you mustn't take this the wrong way, scouring the streets of London for young boys to come and live on Clumber Park and sing beautifully, and that they did. We have a library of choral music, and they performed services daily at some point, and certainly all the festivals were sung in high pomp when the Duke was there. And there was a school, and these boys, a lot of them from the less salubrious parts of London, were given an education and very often stayed on once their voices are broken, and lived and stayed on the park. The sinister-looking one in the middle is a German gentleman, Dolph, who was actually killed during the Second World War, fighting for the English. Here is the little Duke, as he's known, because he was very small, on those terrace gardens. And he is the man who was, as Gavin said, so very, very special. And I'm sure he thought himself very special. I'm sure he didn't really think very much about why. It was because he was who he was. He was a Duke. and his only concern really was that he was a duke amongst dukes. And it's very interesting that Clumber House, his trustees rebuilt it, and then in 1938 they knocked it down and they didn't rebuild it. Just literally across the boundary of the south end of his park on Thoresby, they knocked down and rebuilt 3 houses before they decided to keep the fourth. Am I right? The third, sorry. They knocked down 2 houses before they decided to keep the third, and then abandon it to a hotel, and they have just finished building the fourth. Yes, the Duke had lovely hobbies, and one of his most, I think, charming was that he liked going out rambling, and he liked slumming it. I mean, it wasn't really slumming it, of course, but he liked going out and being normal amongst the populace, and actually did this a lot in the home counties. He had another house near his beloved school, Eton, called Forest Farm, and that was where he kept the Bohemian. But here it is in a little lane. The horses are having their lunch. But the other lovely thing is that the Duke was a great photographer, and that passion, you can see the little gentleman trying to hide in the bushes on the left-hand side is a photographer, not the Duke, but is obviously someone he brought along to take photographs for him. I think this one might be an actual ducal photograph. It's one of the great sadnesses. I've not been able to trace any of his negatives positively, but I think this one might be him, especially as it's obviously not one taken by the gentleman in the bowler hat. And the Duchess, for he had one. The Duchess liked dogs, hence why there are kennels on the park, because the kennels, obviously there were always hunting kennels, but the kennels that now house the excellent brewery that produces the beer were built for the Duchess and her botsois, and she bred these Russian wolfhounds. She and her Duke here at the Clumber Show on the South Lawns opposite the mansion. A full agricultural, horticultural show taking place. It's wonderful. You look as though you've got Kaiser Bill, sort of his Batman just there on the right. Don't look. This is about 1904, the Clumber Show taking place, which emphasised that Clumber wasn't just a place where a duke lived and his servants, it was actually a whole community. With, as we say, a choir school and an economy. This is in the village. You can just see the back on the right there, one of the terrace of cottages, very grand cottages, built by the 7th Duke's grandfather for his burgeoning staff, a whole village, and agriculture was one of the main occupations of the park and of the estate, which helped support the house and indeed the choir school. But so also was timber, and here the timber team clearing through some of the woodland at Clumber, and this still carries on today with the Forestry Commission having planted over 1/3 of the park with coniferous woods. Here it was all obviously deciduous by agreement with the National Trust back in the 1940s. And then that timber was taken to the joiner's shop on the park and worked for whatever use there might be, either for sale or actually for turning into use agriculturally or otherwise. And it was a place where families lived. This family obviously taken, not in the 7th Duke, well, sort of in the 30s, just after the 7th Duke's time, lived on the park. Whole communities, I say, there was a school, as well as the choir school, there was a village school, and a flourishing economy. And all that was rocked to its foundations by this event. The 7th Duke of Newcastle had actually retired to Forest Farm. He'd really not come to Clumber much after the First World War or during it. But he died childless. His widow promptly closed the choir school, sold 70% of all the vestments, which must have grieved the heart of the dead Duke, and then retired herself to Forest Farm. And the Duke's heir, his brother, the 8th Duke, had no intention of coming and living on Clumber. He preferred his comfortable house at Dorking in Surrey. And so it was the Earl of Lincoln, the future 9th Duke of Newcastle, who gradually made his way and sort of made an occasional residence with his agent just in Worksop. And when he finally did get married, he lived in various houses, but never in the great house, which was described, and here we can see the whole layout still going strong in the 1930s, but you'll observe the formal gardens are a shadow of their former selves without all the bedding and great floriferous effusion. But the walled gardens still going strong, but by this time actually being used for commercial processes, was producing food not for the household, which didn't really exist, but for sale. The house itself was described by the Ninth Duke as a mausoleum of a store, and it was there where all the great heirlooms, the great collection, was stored in a mouldering atmosphere of decay. The West Corridor, one of the least furnished rooms I could show you, so at least you wouldn't get visual indigestion. But even there, you've got immense bronze vases, porphyry, boule, and heraldic chairs, a fraction of the great collection just sitting there in a silent house with no staff. So the inevitable happened. The Earl of Lincoln, as he was before he succeeded his father, had the place stripped, sold, weeks, literally, of sales. The library itself took, I think it was 4 days to sell the library, and there were about 3 weeks in all of sales of contents, including all the garden sculpture. And this, you can see, is one of the last. This is the tail ends being sold. And then the demolition. And that the parts of the house, so almost medical about it, were taken away and used elsewhere. Nottinghamshire County Council, which was just about to build itself a new county hall, bought panelling and other bits and pieces, radiators even, to put into their new county hall, and then the war came. And a wonderful carved fireplace they decided would be for one of the main meeting rooms. After the war, when they came to it, was so riddled with woodworm they burnt it. And there is the house in its final collapse. And here, just the last symbol of Clumber as a great ducal residence. The Duke, the 7th Duke, and indeed his predecessors, enjoyed playing at naval warfare and had fun on the lake, and had a little yacht rigged out as a frigate, miniature, as you can see from the scale here, and she was known as the Lincoln being the ancient subtitle, as it were, of the courtesy title of the Dukes of Newcastle, Earls of Lincoln. And here, some kids, during the war, the poor old hulk, as she was then, she'd lost her superstructure, was stuck in the ice. And children went out to play, and here they are, recorded there. And shortly after this photograph was taken, they decided they'd have a little bonfire. And so she went to the bed of the lake. The house was gone, and the whole place was sold in 1946 and bought by the National Trust as part of its Golden Jubilee celebrations. So that's where we're at. No house. Been a problem for us ever since, really. Thank you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I hope my English is good enough for all of you to understand me. If I'm not clear, please don't hesitate to ask, and I'll try to be clear. I will really try to stay within the 15-minute time frame, give you a little overview of the work of Helene Kröller-Müller, especially with regard to her collaboration with Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, or as he was called in the time that she was working with him, Ludwig Mies. He only added the van der Rohe in 1921. So in 1912 he was still Ludwig Mies. Helene Kröller-Müller was originally born in Germany, And she moved to Holland in 1888 when she married a Dutch businessman, Anton Krulle. And at first she had this very normal life of a higher bourgeoisie lady. She was, I won't tell you everything about her biography, but a very crucial point in her life, a very crucial year was 1911. 1911, she was diagnosed with a very serious illness, and she had to go into hospital, had to undergo surgery, but the surgery itself was very dangerous as well. So her odds to survive were very small. And at that time, she was 42 at that time, she was confronted with her own mortality. And that, of course, made her think about her life, about what she had done so far. At that time, she already had started collecting for about 4 years. And this was a very interesting collection. It had some works by Vincent van Gogh, but it was still a rather modest collection. But when she was diagnosed with this illness and confronted with the fact that she had to undergo this very serious surgery, she decided that she wanted to do more with her collection. It should add something. It should not only be just her personal hobby. It really should. She wanted to leave a token of her existence to future generations. So she did not only want to add to her collection, really make an extraordinary collection of it, but she also wanted to place this collection in a museum. At first her idea was to build a house museum or a museum house, a place where she could both live and she could also exhibit her collection. She wrote about this. During her life, she wrote about 3,000 letters, so I had a vast source of information to retrieve her motivations, and it was also something that I tried to do while writing about her life. And she wrote, when she decided this in 1911, she wrote to her confidant about this idea to leave a museum to the Dutch public, saying, and with these words really pointing out her motive, in 100 years' time it should be an interesting monument to culture, a great lesson showing how far a merchant's family of the beginning of the century had progressed as regards inner refinement. It will be a museum so authentic and alive as no museum ever before. Might be that it's not all grammatically correct, but you probably understand what it means. So she really wanted to leave something to be remembered, and especially the phrase "a merchant's family" is very vital here. She moved to Holland. She became one of the wealthiest women in Holland, but especially in the city where she lived, The Hague, which is a very aristocratic city, she was really considered to be nouveau riche. So this was one of her driving forces to show to all the aristocrats in her neighborhood that she wasn't nouveau riche, that she actually had perhaps even better taste than all those traditional collectors around her. Well, this collection, of course, had to be housed in a museum. She really would strive the rest of her life to build this monument to culture, as she called it. So as soon as she left the hospital in November 1911, she heard the pace with which she added paintings to her collection was really astonishing. To give you just one example, in March 1912, she traveled to Paris with her husband Anton and her advisor Bremer, who really taught her everything she knew about art. She spent there 3 days, and she returned home with 15 paintings by Vincent van Gogh. And this was in 1912, so this was really before Vincent van Gogh was very, in a way, an obscure artist. People really associated him with his suicide and with crazy, colorful paintings, but not with being a great artist. That only happened during and after the First World War. So this was really astonishing. Later on, she would even buy 21 paintings of Van Gogh at a single auction, and she, in the end, would gather the largest collection of works by Vincent van Gogh in the world after the Van Gogh Museum. So some ladies go to Paris and buy hats and handbags. She bought works by Vincent van Gogh. So that's just to give you an impression of the scale in which she was thinking and working and trying to realize this monument to culture. But of course, this incredible collection had to be housed. So she was looking for an architect who could build a museum that could not only house this collection, but would, just like the collection itself, would be an expression of her vision of life, of her outlook to life, of what she thought was important, and it should also, just like her collection, should be able to stand the test of time. At first she contacted Peter Behrens, a German architect who, as you can see, made very beautiful designs for an estate called Ellenwoude. This is an estate in Wassenaar. At that time, Wassenaar is very near to The Hague, in the western part of Holland, close to the sea, a lot of dunes, a lot of forest, very beautiful area. So that's where they bought this estate, and this is the place where Helene at first wanted to build her museum house. This picture you've seen before. Indeed, Helene and her husband were one of the wealthiest couples in Holland, so they didn't really care about a few thousand guilders, more or less. So indeed, they really wanted to see how this museum house would look like in the estate, on the estate which they had purchased. And yes, indeed, this is a one-to-one scale, so that it was completely constructed out of wood and linen, and it was indeed placed on a movable construction. So it was very important to her that she could really decide where on this estate this building would be. To her, it was very important that the building would have an open plain in front of it, but at the same time it should have a very clear background. So dunes or woods had to be on the back, so it was kind of it had something to lean on, so to say. And what was also very important to her was that the house was, and this is a quote, was as open as a rose in full bloom. It should be completely open, accessible to the public, but also within the landscape, really literally accessible. To her, she was a fond reader of Spinoza. To her, it was very important that the house expressed an atmosphere of calm, of peace, of serenity, honesty. So this was what she wanted to express with this house. Behrens came pretty close, but the cooperation between the two of them didn't really work out. At the time Helene was working with Peter Behrens, Ludwig Mies was one of his assistants. And Helene was very fond of this Ludwig Mies, who was a very talented, very young, very ambitious architect. He was only 26 at this time. And she had much more faith in him than in Behrens, because Behrens was old and he was stubborn and he just had these ideas that he didn't listen to her. And Ludwig Mies obviously did. So after a big fight between Ludwig Mies and Behrens, Helene decided to work with Ludwig Mies. But this was not very self-evident that Ludwig Mies would actually be the next architect, because Mr. Bremer, Helene's advisor, was a big fan of a Dutch architect called Berlage. I don't know whether some of you have heard of him. In Holland he was and still is a celebrated architect. And Berlage really wanted him to build this museum house. This made Helene doubt a lot, so she didn't quite know to go for Berlage, which would be a very safe option, or for Mies van der Rohe, who would be the young new generation. So she gave them both the assignment to make a model, to make sketches, and to propose to her their designs so that she could make up her mind. Oh, excuse me, this is a photo of Ludwig Mies in the time that he was working for Helene, and a picture of the older Berlage. And this was also, the picture was taken later, but Berlage was actually 30 years older than Ludwig Mies, which was one of the reasons why Helene thought that he might be more equipped to build this house, which had to be an expression of her outlook on life. And she thought, well, someone who is more mature might be able to put this vision in a building. So that was most of her. That's mostly why she thought that Berlage would be a better option as well. With hindsight, you could say that Berlage indeed was very talented, had many qualities, but I think the Netherlands would have been very proud if Ludwig Mies van der Rohe had built the museum, but alas. Two drawings by Mies van der Rohe. He made these designs in May, June, and July. Both architects, both Berlage and Mies van der Rohe, both started to work on these designs. Berlage worked in Amsterdam at his own office, but Mies van der Rohe moved to The Hague, and he was provided with an office at the main quarters of Müller & Co., the family firm of the Krullers. Helene visited him every day, and she talked to him every day, and she didn't go one moment to chance to tell him what she thought was important in this design, what she thought what was important in life. So they worked very closely together for many months. And this is something that she had this vision in her head of what was important to her, what her museum house should be expressing, but she wasn't really able to really communicate this to Ludwig Mies. At the one time, she really stressed the fact that atmosphere was the most important part, that the museum house should be this expression of this Spinozan calm and sincerity. At other times, she said, no, this house should really be an expression of my life. So not a single room should just be situated anywhere, but there where it reflects the life that I lead. So this also shows how this expression of her personal, very individual visions should be built, woven into this museum. These are two photographs of the scale model that Ludwig Mies presented. Both Ludwig Mies and Berlage presented in September their models and their sketches, so they really had to show their whole work, the whole progress that they made. But Helene Kröller-Müller couldn't decide. She had these two wonderful scale models. This is the Ludwig Mies, as you can I use this? Yes. Front view. This would be the part, the entrance of the building. The lower of the ground floor would be sort of a gallery, an entrance hall. On the first floor would be the family. Oh, there. The family room, so that would be divided. The museum function and the living function were divided, and here would be the gallery for the service, for the prints and drawings, and this is the grand gallery for all the paintings. So it was an enormous building, also very closely related to the surrounding landscape. This is a replica that the Kröller-Müller Museum made later on, because the original unfortunately vanished. So not only the house itself vanished, but the plan as well. And this is the plan presented by Berlage. And as you can see, and this was also something that Helene didn't like about this proposal, was that Berlage really made a house that he thought belonged to this wealthy couple. So it is rather pompous, it is grand, it is abundant in its luxury. Helene Kröller-Müller complained in one of her letters, what does a little lady like me, she as well was a very little person, what does a lady like me has to do with, what do I need 7 staircases for? It's like having 7 watches. It doesn't help you tell the time any better. So there was too much luxury in these houses. She didn't everything that she thought was important, the sincerity, the openness, the simplicity, was all ignored by Berlage. This is just to compare the two buildings. One of her specific wishes was that that her house would be a long, drawn-out structure. That all the rooms would be situated next to each other, so that there were not 2 or 3 floors, but that all the rooms could be easily accessed, that they were not hidden behind other rooms or behind other spaces, which is also something Berlage absolutely ignored. Nonetheless, Bremmer, Helene's advisor, had a specific preference for Berlage, and he convinced Helene to work with him, with the Dutch architect. But Helene was very disappointed because, of course, she had so closely worked with Mies van der Rohe in this period. So Anton Kröller, a very loyal man who couldn't stand the disappointment of his wife, so he suggested that design by Ludwig Mies was also constructed was also built in wood and linen, so that she could get an impression of this building on this site. So again, a 1-to-1 scale was built again on this moving construction for Helene to see how it would work in the landscape. And again, it was all for nothing, because in the end she did choose for Berlage. Well, to make a long story short, this is another building. When the 1-to-1 scale model scale was built, Mies van der Rohe made a drawing of it, but not only that, to give Helene a real impression of what it would look like, he, with hand-paintingly, how do you say that? He hand-paintingly drew bricks on the linen to give really this impression that it was how it would look like, but it all didn't matter. She worked with Berlage. This is a card of Holland to show you Wassenaar is on the left in the very grey industrialized area. In the end, Berlage would design a museum. Where is the... Over here, and it's very green, very natural, very foresty surroundings, where he would at first design an enormous museum, which was supposed to be a sort of Louvre on the Veluwe, really incredible building, but due to the economic recession and the bankruptcy of Müller & Co., this couldn't take place. So in fact, Helene didn't assign just one missing house. This missing house by Ludwig Mies was in fact just one of an entire series of missing houses, of proposals for houses and for museums. In the end, in 1938, she could actually open a museum, but it wasn't this enormous Louvre-like museum. It was a rather modest museum designed by Henri van der Velde, because also with Berlage she got into a fight. She wasn't the easiest person in the world. But in 1938 she could open the Kröller-Müller Museum. She was the first director for another year. She died in 1939. But in this period, she remained to refer to this museum as a temporary museum. In the end, it would be, she kept believing that there would be this great, enormous museum on the Veluwe, which still doesn't exist. The temporary museum was expanded, and nowadays it's still one of the most visited museums in Holland. And I think she did succeed in making or leaving this monument to culture. Thank you.
We've been continuing gathering research. Carry on with the panel discussion.
Yeah, some good bits in there. I was just thinking about the two characters and wanted to ask Ava how you didn't mention a sense of, and I hadn't really got an idea of how you think Helen Kroller-Muller might have been perceived in her position. And I'm interested in that idea of a woman collector and so a woman being in charge and a custodian and taking the lead and forming something quite strong, whether that would have been seen as something quite radical in Dutch society, or whether just the fact that she was nouveau riche.
It was more that. It was especially the nouveau riche part that made it, that's what was for her very important, to show that she had more inner refinement than most of the aristocrat collectors. But in fact the collection to her was also very important in order to be something else than just a mother and a wife. The traditional roles that she had to play in her situation, being married to this successful businessman, and starting this collection, building a museum, really gave her her own identity or her own way of leaving a mark. So she wasn't just depending on other people to have this. But it was, of course, she was very well aware of the fact that she, as a woman in the 1910s, couldn't just stand up and say what she wanted. She really had to play it very subtle. I always say she didn't only collect paintings, she also collected men who she could manipulate in this way that they in the end would do what she couldn't do as a woman, or couldn't do because of the social structure. So she had Bremer to advise her on the paintings and to go to auctions, because as a woman that was also more difficult. The first contact and the first discussions with the architects usually were done by her husband. There's a collection of men who she managed, so to say, to reach her goal. Yeah.
Sort of in hearing the two things, it's like I've only really started to think about that idea of that nouveau riche rising, like a new replacement aristocracy in some way. You've got sort of rising one and a declining one going at the same time. But interested in the fact that both were obviously very aware of the power of architecture and wanting to be quite specific about it. And just remembering something that you showed us, Andrew, before. You showed us, although the Clumber House is obviously pretty ostentatious and grand, that still one of the dukes, I remember maybe that after the fire, when there were some plans for a much grander domed building. So actually what you get there is the minimal, kind of more restrained version, which I think is
yes, it's hard to think of it as restrained, isn't it? But yes, yes. It was actually slightly earlier, before the fire, but the young dukes, seventh Duke's trustees, felt that the house was not fit really, and having not been lived in for a while, and they commissioned Charles Barry, who designed the Houses of Parliament, to produce this extraordinary, massive, great thing with a dome, rather like St Paul's Cathedral sitting in the middle of it. Which surprisingly wasn't adopted once the fire made actually rebuilding the house essential. They went back to Barry, but obviously put the brakes on financially, and so we have this lesser product as a result.
The other thing I wanted to ask you was that you mentioned that you felt that probably the Duke really wasn't aware of the look or the status in some way apart from just as competitive. But was wondering if you had found any information that might give a sort of mindset nearer to the time of the house being demolished, how aware they were of only just their personal crisis of having to deal with that, or whether there might have been a much larger awareness of a sense of crisis for the whole of the country that they were, I don't know, did they feel victimised at that time, or did they feel like they were the problem? Or
I wonder. I think. I mean, the changing social, shifting social sands of England Britain in the 1920s and 30s, which was the time which led up to the dissolution of Clumber. I think enormous social change in the First World War. We all know it set off a massive change. Basically, the liberation of women. They no longer were kept at home. They actually had found they could and did work and liked it, and not just working in service in a house, but in factories and in their own right. Beginning when the middle classes were the last to be liberated, it was the working people who began to realise. And so, traditional rural feudal structures such as Clumber were threatened enormously. And I think, I'm not sure quite how bright the Cavendish Fiennes Hope Clinton family was, and therefore how politically aware they might have been. Certainly the ninth Duke, the Earl of Lincoln, as he was at that time, was a young man, and he enjoyed playing cricket, and he was an ace pilot during the war, and he had if you like, a rather gilded youth, and I don't suppose he thought very much about that, and it was he who decided that the house was ridiculous, and sold everything out of it, without much of a backward glance, but he still had the idea that he would live at Clumber, and that he would live in, as you know, a smaller, new, modern, we don't know what the design would have been, of course, house. Interestingly, his neighbour Welbeck had done exactly the same thing, and had built a house, the Duke of Portland, in which he lived, and the great mansion was left unoccupied for quite a long time.
And was there ever, prior to the National Trust taking over the building, I was just wondering whether there was ever a sense of offering out the collection or the house ever to the public to ever come and see it? Any of those? There
was a great exhibition which happened in Manchester, where it was almost competition to see how much of your stuff you could lend, and that took place in 1860. It was after the Great Exhibition in London. It was a sort of a northern copy of that. I think it was in the 1860s. As I told you before, I'm no good with dates. Certainly the Duke of Newcastle lent several works of art. I got a copy of the catalogue, which was mostly about the people who'd lent it, rather than a list of the people who'd lent, rather than the objects themselves. But the Duke certainly did lend several works of art to that. So there was a sort of feeling of noblesse oblige, I suppose. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in that idea of, was Helen's idea always that it would be open to the public, it would be publicly available, even the first time in 1912?
Yes, well, not at the very beginning. At first she really was thinking about after her death, then it would be a public museum. She wanted to leave it, to bequeath it, but from 1913 onwards, she had this temporary exhibition room in The Hague, and she opened. It began with just a solo exhibition of the work by Vincent van Gogh, but this was a big success. So she decided to open this temporary exhibition room permanently, and in fact, it was one of the first museums of modern art in Europe, because many of the other museums they just didn't have their own collection of modern art. It started in the 1920s. So it's one of the very rare places in Europe where people could permanently see the work by Mondrian, Picasso, Van Gogh, Seurat, Signac. So it was, and that helped her to. It really. Stressed for her the importance to leave this monument to culture, as she called it. So, yeah.
Do you know about any of the history around how the Rietveld pavilion ended up at Krollenmoor, or is that out? Because I know that's later than after she died, and
yes.
in another 20 years. But
well, in 1951, the museum opened in 1938. It was just the museum itself. In 1951, they also opened this sculpture garden at the other side of the museum. And what they, so there's another director, it was a later director.
That wasn't from ideas that Helen would have had, or
well,
was it?
actually, Helena was rather stubborn, as I might have pointed out before, and she considered her collection to be final. The collection as it were, it shouldn't be changed or altered in any way, so no painting should be sold, but neither should any paintings be added to the collection. It was a whole, it shouldn't be changed anymore. So for later directors, this was very difficult because indeed the museum would become a mausoleum, as you said, because it can't breathe, it doesn't live anymore. So they had to be very creative to think of ways to add to the collection without ignoring her wishes, without ignoring her will. So they came up with the idea of opening a sculpture garden because her testament explicitly mentioned paintings, but not sculpture. Yeah. So that's also the reason why there is the new wing of the Kalamula Museum is completely dedicated to conceptual art. Yes, thank you. Which of course is also it's not painting, and it is also something that she could not have mentioned in her will because it didn't exist at the time. So
that's smart, man.
That way they have worked around her wishes, and it works out pretty well because there is this very contemporary and this classic modern art, and the sculpture garden, which also combines culture and nature, which was very important to her. So that's the Rietveld Pavilion is part of that process of also adding this sculpture to the museum.
Yeah, I just wondered how aware they were of that sense of lost architecture, reclaiming architecture, bringing it back to life, or whether it was just a desired form, just because it's a very interesting person.
Yes, I think that was the main. Rietveld was, of course, one of the cherished designers and architects in Holland, so it was very important to them. And of course, because to Helene Krullenmuller herself, architecture was very important. So that was a reason why they accentuated works that were related to architecture or were a piece of architecture itself. It is a focal point in a way, yes. Yeah.
I just remembered, actually, I forgot to mention in the talk that when I saw that image of the hand holding the model, and I'd always been interested in Rietveld's work and thought that's amazing. But when I started to read more and realised it was, I didn't know at that point when I loved the image that had been rebuilt at the Krullenmuller Museum, and it was one of those sort of perfect coincidence moments. Everything just seemed, I thought, maybe I'm a bit insane, and I already knew that somehow and must have put it into place, but it seemed to
fit in perfectly.
Yeah, but that, in a way, I liked that sense of, in hearing the two, there's a sort of hallucinogenic sense of the world floating in and out of each other somehow, of very differing spaces that makes me feel like there's art there to be got. There's something to be mined all the time in between those two positions.
I have a question actually for both Andrew and Eva. How, Andrew, do you find that people approach Clumber Park possibly differently from other National Trust properties where there is very much a present building? And I'm also wondering how apart from Gavin falling upon an image in a book, is it possible to know about this sort of unmade history and in Holland? But sorry.
Well, I think Clumber was taken on by the National Trust in 1946 as a vast open space, really, and as a place of resort for a lot of industrial towns, from Nottingham in the south right the way around up to Sheffield in the north and Doncaster. A lot of areas where people who lived in those towns didn't have a public green space that they could go to. And we tend to think of that as a sort of problem of nowadays, and where our politicians are trying to sort that out. Very much seen as a problem in the, well, just in the aftermath of the Second World War. And so I think Clumber was conceived, as far as the National Trust was concerned, as a very different property from your average great country house. But that's not to forget that the National Trust was set up in 1895 as an organisation to provide access to green and open spaces for people, long before it got itself concerned with country houses, which came along really in the 1930s. And so I think there's a sense of Clumber being very much part of that core of the National Trust's purpose, and a renewal of that at its Golden Jubilee, which 1945 was. We actually only completed the purchase in 46, but negotiations were going on in 45.
I think it was quite interesting on one of the tours that the very absence of the building meant that in actual fact people felt like they could engage with the greenery around far more than perhaps having such a dominant building in the property.
For the Kröller-Müller Museum, is of course there is a museum now, so that makes it slightly different from the fact that there isn't a big hole in the ground where it was supposed to be built. But the Kröller-Müller Museum is situated in a natural reserve of 6,000 square acres. It's an enormous landscape, natural reserve, and in the middle of that was this place where this gigantic museum was supposed to be built, but it was the building was cancelled only a year after they started. So there are only the foundations of this huge museum, but they left it there. So some people visit the Kröller-Müller not because of the museum, but because of this natural reserve, and they drive or they ride through this reserve and they suddenly see these ruins as if they are in Athens or somewhere. So in that way, this unbuilt building or this unbuilt museum, this missing building is still there, and they are not really doing anything with it. They don't mark it, or they don't put any attention to it, but that in a way adds to the experience. If you don't know anything about this museum or about the history and you just travel across this reserve, you suddenly see these ruins and you automatically start to wonder, what is this? And so it makes people curious, and they start their own investigations, most of them, some of them.
And I feel like sort of support structures practice in the sense of looking for something to support, and perhaps one element is supporting and making known in a very particular way these stories of houses that were not built or taken down, and sort of offering them up to the public. And I'd like to offer the discussion up to the public if anybody has any questions. Yeah, there's a roving mic. I think it's best.
Thanks. I was wondering if the National Trust ever actually builds buildings itself. So I've noticed increasingly that the National Trust is inviting artists quite often now to make works in their properties, and it seems the logical outcome of all of this talk is for Clumber House to have a gallery in it.
I don't know who's best placed to even answer this. Actually, perhaps the lady sitting right behind you. But
I won't embarrass Beth.
It's a conjecture, but it's impossible not to. Once you think of it, you think, that's a good idea.
And the National Trust the short answer is does build buildings, yes, but they're rather prosaic. They sort of tend to be restaurants and lavatories. But nonetheless, we get very good architects to design them, and they themselves, no doubt, are buildings of interest, and indeed some have become so. And some, of course, have been demolished and superseded and have disappeared. So you've got something similar working there, if you like, but I don't think we think of them in those terms. Whether the National Trust would build buildings as artworks, now that's a very interesting one. I don't know whether we would see it.
It's more thinking that the National Trust is commissioning a lot of artworks,
yes,
and it would seem like perhaps a collection might naturally grow from that, and they might want somewhere to house it.
I see.
There were versions of some of the proposals where we were thinking that a museum of modern art should be built on the Clumber House plot, and really we started thinking about what that relationship was between sites and that had hosted art as well. There was considerable collection there in that house. When we looked through the lists, and it's quite bonkers, the names and the number, the quantities of works that were there.
If the National Trust had taken Clumber, which it wouldn't have been able to, but if it had taken Clumber complete with its house and its collections, it would be one of the greatest properties in that regard that the National Trust would now own. It would have knocked Stourhead and others right off their pinnacles. It would have one of the greatest collections. It was one of the very, very great private collections in England. And it's interesting, one of the other dukery estates, which is still very much in private hands and still very complete, Welbeck, which is adjacent to the west, still does have probably the finest, or one of the finest private collections, which nobody ever sees.
But we partly decided not to. Partly because Nottingham Contemporary was here in a way, but also because practically we thought we wanted proposals in here to be achievable and realistic, and we felt that there was no way someone was going to spend £150 million and make a museum of contemporary art or modern art or any sort of art there on that site, because there wasn't going to be something like the high speed like going into Birmingham, which gives a possibility that they might spend 150 million on making a museum, because when you're spending 36 billion on a project, then you need some other destination points to make that give extra value. And so without that kind of driver, we didn't think it was worth putting that in the end, and we decided that we would plant flowers on it instead or something.
There's somebody right in front of you.
Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to ask a question of Gavin, really, and yourself and Celine. And I suppose one thing that was coming to mind when you're talking about the ghost buildings and the buildings being demolished and replaced and that process is that in England it seems to be something where we feel the regret at the loss of buildings, but in a culture like Japan, the tradition is you bulldoze the buildings and some are rebuilt and some are never replaced. But there seems to be a very strong cultural element to this attachment to buildings and the idea of buildings as being permanent rather than changing. And I was just curious if that had come up at all in your thinking.
Yeah, I think very much that. As well as being, I'm really interested in that notion of a time span for a building, and very interested in architects that have proposed that. Someone like Archigram proposing that a building shouldn't last longer than 10 or 20 years. But I think in a way we felt it, that there is obviously a national psychosis of some kind in relation to that, and that there might be some useful things from it, so that we were wondering maybe we weren't supporting Clumber Park or the National Trust there. Instead, what we might be able to do is support that psychosis, so support a notion of crisis, of change, but the buildings might just represent crisis in relation to class and class systems changing in the country, or a desire to change class, a desire to change systems of power and authority and devolving power in some ways. So, we felt that what was interesting was this sense of. I started to, when we put in the idea of the Tottenham riots re-performance and wanted other acts of violence or assault on civic situations in a way. was because we sort of started to feel that you could equate the idea of destroying that building as a riot, as an assault, as a destruction of something that may not have needed to go, or that it was a good example of something that needed to go. You know, so it might be really necessary, like a riot might be necessary at a time to make change happen. It's just as a symbol of the desire to change. So.
It's really, you'd have almost reenacted history that didn't happen if we did that, because the fourth Duke of Newcastle in 1830, who was a reactionary Tory and hated the idea of parliamentary reform and extending the franchise, and he, when the reform bill was going through its processes in Parliament and looked as though it was going to be rejected, he got quite worried, and he armed and defended Clumber. He left Nottingham Castle, sadly, which he also owned, which was burnt out by rioters. But they never got as far as Clumber, sadly. I mean, it could have been quite a show, couldn't it?
Although I suppose that then relates to one of your strange coincidences, because then Nottingham Castle became the first municipal gallery.
Yes.
It's a nice one, I didn't know that.
I wonder, is the public going to be able to participate in a sort of voting process at the Clumber Park site as to which of these proposals they most favour, or say the top 10 or something like that? May I put to you this idea that on one of the interior walls you have a sort of an interactive board where you make your choice and it lights up for all around you to see. Because I think this could be recorded on film and become an installation in its own right, either there or at a later date. And also it could be self-funding, because surely proposal 35, should it be chosen by people, their picture could be immediately beamed to the authorities, who would gladly pay for the evidence.
Reread it for us.
Plant various types of cannabis across Clumber Park, create new self-sustainable industry of coffee shops in the Amsterdam style across the park.
May I claim a small percentage of any revenue gained? Thank you very much.
I like the idea of the voting system. And a voting system that is a donation system as well. You donate the money for the planting of the cannabis at that point. I mean, there are a number of ones which try to flout the legality of the site, I suppose, or existing laws on there, which I think also is a reference to this sense that that site may have been above the law at one point, you know, or was the law. So. I think it's just such a rich site. So I think it should be used exactly for that, for public voting, because actually the number of people that go to the site would be really useful for that. And they're going to this site, and why are they going there? Whether it is just to escape, but actually they're entering into something that carries these stories that can help you think your position in England or in the world. I think that's so. Even something like a voting system for something like that could, I think, in a way, the idea is that it should support thinking through those processes and placing yourself, not thinking that that's separate from you. Clumber affects you. Clumber has always affected the people of England. The way that aristocracy is there affected everybody, but you may not have just realised it. You may not have had that access to it. So I think that choosing system, so all of these proposals are just about that choice and about something either taken away or given to you. So, yeah, that could work.
When I thought about it, the question was more technical about where the museum is in the Netherlands. And is it
where it is situated? You mean?
Yeah, is it like a pilgrimage in some sense, or?
Well, it is situated in the eastern part of Holland, and it isn't. Well, of course, by car it's easily accessible, but indeed it is rather difficult to get there by public transport. Still, but this in a way was an intention of Helene Kröller-Müller again, because she didn't want her museum to be situated in a very crowded city, which is also why I showed you the map. She foresaw that this western part of Holland would become one big suburb, which it is at the moment. So she wanted to have her museum in the middle of nature, and that people really had to make a decision to go to the museum. So not just walk around the street in a big city and rush in and out of a museum, but really make a conscious decision to go there and to also experience the nature and the combination of nature and the paintings, abstract paintings, which was, she thought you needed the rest of this natural surroundings to really appreciate and really have the rest to contemplate over the paintings and the artworks. So this was, it is very difficult. Very difficult. It is. It takes some time, but from Amsterdam it takes you a train and a bus, so it is doable. But yes, you still have to make a very conscious decision to go there. Yeah.
I guess in terms of the work that's there. Is there something maybe about building a modern museum at modern contemporary art gallery or at Clumber Park? There was something about where art comes from. These overall, and kind of, you think maybe an urban idea of contemporary art, maybe it doesn't feel right within the kind of bucolic kind of landscape.
Yes, it works rather well, I must say. It is. You wouldn't. I think we are all very used to the fact that modern museums for modern or contemporary art are situated in the city centre. It's just not done very often to place it in the midst of nature. But I think it's.
Our proposal was at number 9. It was partly in relation to that, the idea of how artists practice and how they locate works, and it's to curate a meeting of temporary architectural structures and pavilions loaned by artists, designers, architects and organisations around the world on the site of Clumber House. And in a way that could be a continuous thing. And when I was looking at what's in the collection at the Kröller-Müller Museum, they've got a very early Atelier van Lieshout room, mobile unit, which is it's just an amazing thing. It's one of the ones that looks like it's got a tumour sticking out of the side of it, and an early one that you might recognise if you're aware of their work. It's a really key piece. And I kind of thought that, in a sense, they're dealing with this other practice of artists that has emerged, I suppose, that Helena wasn't collecting because it wasn't really there. And the sense that you could bring that would be simple to bring to Clumber Park, and that would be something that deals with that idea of everyone travelling there. It's exactly the same journey. And actually, if you look around the world and see what's there's a wealth of that practice going on. So you could bring a Dan Graham and Atelier van Lieshout, and you could choose 20 amazing things. And I was thinking about Joanne Tatham and Tom O'Sullivan had made 2 small pavilions. Well, 2 small, they're quite big, but they're compared to the building that it was in front of, Fettes College in Edinburgh, and one's a red cat and one's a blue boot, and the idea that was placed in front of this very powerful architecture, and to make political questioning about what's going on in relation to the architecture, that could as easily sit on the site where Clumber House once stood, but it would just operate slightly differently, but still deal with power structures and present art that was designed to be mobile, that is inbuilt to the ideas of a pavilion and what architecture can be. So that I thought was quite an exciting idea, and one that makes sense. It's doable, and people would come to see it. So, say again?
The North East. Situteries.
I don't know what that is.
Are you familiar with that? That Judith King commissioned.
Okay, I can't quite catch what the word is.
Situatories.
Outeries, you know.
Yes.
Okay. Never heard that
You
word.
sit- They were pavilions that were sited. Does
Yeah.
anybody else remember where that is?
We'd bring them as well.
Was that at Belsay?
I mean,
Was that at Belsay?
Yes.
At Belsay, yeah.
yeah, I know of a meeting of maybe about 2003, something like that, in Kassel, in Germany. There was a meeting of or mobile architectural structures. So I think there's been a number that are out there, and then one like Van Lieshout, so they've been recently renovating it because now there's a period of time that sort of work is not quite lasting, or has to be built in a certain way. And I think there's a time to bring a whole, a couple of decades of that sort of work together, I suppose. So you could bring the Vito Conci 1970s structure along, as well as a brand new commission. So there's quite a wealth of works out there for that. But it would be a good context for it in that sense. So.
We've overrun by a little bit, but thank you very much to everyone who joined us this evening. I hope that those local will be able to come to the screenings tomorrow evening of The Shining and Beetlejuice, inspired. Actually, one of the proposals being screening programs.
Yeah.
Excuse me, and leaving at 11 o'clock if you are joining us on the coach, leaving from here to Clumber Park on Sunday morning. No dogs allowed on the bus. But thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers.